Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Cryptids and Monsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue the next chapter associated with the Occult Investigator, Real Cases from the Files of Ex-Investigations book by Bob Johnson. This will be chapter 3 when it comes to this book. Again, I highly recommend reading this book when you have a chance. I have the link included below. That way you can read it for free on a website called archive.org, and you'll be able to enjoy the rest of the chapters as well. But this one has to do with a fascinating case involving a curse. You know how much I love reading about curses, but also a curse of a vampire. And on top of that, it also has Transylvania involved. Lots of interesting things, right, when it comes to this chapter right off the bat. So I'm going to separate it into some separate parts and then give my own thoughts and opinions on it afterward. But in this chapter, it's called The Transylvanian Curse. So let's go ahead and let's showcase part 1 of this chapter, and I'd love to hear what your own thoughts and comments are afterward. So here's essentially part 1. Petrov and Anna Sigisora were the parents of a 16-year-old boy. They lived in a suburban Stratford, Connecticut address, a middle-class town known more for its ethnic mix. Their son, Charles, was an average teenager for the better part of his youth. He was a good student and was interested in girls, sports, and of course, every video game he could get his hands on, especially anything to do with role-playing of the Dungeons and Dragons variety. And his parents indulged his fantasies despite the fact that he spent too much time on the computer and at the local comic book store playing the games and discussing the intricacies of spells and demons with his friends. Even the occasional brooding after losing one of those role-playing games and the burst of anger directed at his peers who bested him at the latest bout were tolerated by Petrov and Anna. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and despite Anna's dedication to her Russian Orthodox religion and its strict proscription against delving into anything occult or magical, Anna even cast a blind eye towards Charles's latest obsession with vampire role-playing games. Despite his occult learnings, Charles pleased his parents. Petrov was particularly happy when Charles turned 16, the customary age that ushered a boy into manhood in Petrov and Anna's hometown of Sighisora, Romania, the name they chose for their surname here in America, which was located in Transylvania. This marked the beginning of great things for Charles and Petrov's mind: independence, career planning, thoughts of a family, religious commitment, and most of all, learning the history and secret code of the family that was the creed by which all of its men lived. It was a blood oath of sorts that bonded each male member of the family forever. The oath had been created centuries ago in the ranks of the warring armies of Romania as they fought the Roman legions. The blood oath was as sacred as any religious teaching or doctrine and was far more revered and equally feared because of the claim that the blood oath had been forged to protect the family from dark forces of nature. If the blood oath was not followed to the letter, great misery would befall them. If it was desecrated in any way, a family would be cursed forever to a quote-unquote living death. Petrov was elated by Charles's birthday, but his joy soon turned to terror when he learned that his son had blasphemously perverted the family's blood oath and may have even suffered the quote-unquote living death by becoming a vampire. According to Petrov and Anna, the trouble began when Charles became involved in a local goth scene in Stratford. They tolerated the role-playing gaming, and the many afternoons and evenings Charles and his friends whiled away at the hours playing and discussing the battles and magical incantations they were using against each other to gain victory. The role-playing they switched to a game they said was called The Gathering, where clans of vampires competed with each other in life-or-death struggles that included horrific acts of brutality and many blasphemies. Anna recounted how she cringed one evening when learning that Charles was planning on decapitating one of his rivals. I knew it was just a game, but the way Charles described it to his friend with all of the gory details, severing the head just below the Adam's apple so the artery would gush blood in the quickest manner, well, it was too much for me to handle. I screamed at him, "Charles, this is disgusting talk. God does not want to hear that from your mouth, even if it's a game." It disturbed me to no end when Charles's mom said, "God has no place in this." When Charles said, "Mom, God has no place in this world." Now, the vampire role-playing quickly expanded between Charles and his peers. The boys began to dress in all-black Victorian Gothic clothing, often wearing pale makeup and painting their fingernails black. Although it was quite disturbing, too, the sorcerers, they believed that Charles was a good boy at heart and was participating in faddish behavior with his friends, as do most adolescent boys. The group that called itself the Brooding began as a Friday evening game-playing gathering at one of the boys' house. When Charles hadn't requested that the Brooding use the sorcerer's house for over 2 months, Petrov became suspicious and asked Charles where his game meetings were being held. Charles confessed that the game playing was over and that the group was now hanging out at a local teen golf club. He said to me, "Dad, there are girls there. There's more fun than games now." I couldn't argue the point with a 16-year-old boy. I thought it was fine and healthy despite his crazy clothing, Petrov said. But Anna had deep and disturbing reservations about her son's new behavior. She was always more attuned to her son's demeanor, something she attributed to her gypsy sight, an uncanny ability to sense both good and evil manifestations in relatives and close friends. And of course, being Charles's mother, alerted Anna even more to a strange feeling she received from her son in the last few months. She described it as a morose, black shadow that was seeping into his spirit. When I asked Anna if she could give me an example of her impression, she said that it was as if the light of Charles's soul is being slowly extinguished like an eclipse of the sun. A giant blackness is overshadowing my boy. I become more frightened every day. I pray that it is just my imagination, but it is much too strong, and it is getting stronger. I had to tell Petrov it has become so bad, and I am very, very frightened, Anna said. Her fears were not unfounded. Anna began to find Charles's soiled shirt spotted with what looked like blood. First, there was just a small round droplet stains that she discounted as perhaps some cherry juice or some other fruit stain. But when those spots became larger and had the distinct deep dark red, almost black color of human blood, Anna became alarmed. She became so obsessed with the increasing bloodstains that she literally tore apart Charles's room one afternoon to inspect all of his belongings. Anna searched every drawer, his closet, under his bed, each shelf, even went through his boxes of magazines and books. What she found was at first more curious than disturbing. Anna discovered a silver box she had never seen before that looked antique and was inscribed with strange symbols. She opened it cautiously and was perplexed to see that it was filled with rich black earth, the kind you might get from a plant nursery, dense and black, not at all the type found in backyards of most local homes. And the instant she opened the box, she noticed an alarming odor she could only describe as the smell of decay and death, very old and musty, yet at the same time mixed with a human scent. She also swore that she saw bone fragments mixed in with the earth. She felt a chill run down her spine as her gypsy sight tingled. She told me that she felt the darkness once again that she knew was enveloping her son. Anna decided not to confront Charles with the mysterious box until she first spoke with Petrov. When her husband returned home from work that evening, he could see that Anna was troubled. It was that gypsy look in her eyes that told me she experienced something very bad, Petrov said. Anna told Petrov of her morbid discovery, and he quickly blurted out that the change in Charles had occurred right after the discussion of the family blood oath. He recounted that Charles was fascinated with the rituals and the mythos of the earth, but at the same time questioned its validity. Charles had said that the darkness wasn't always a bad place and that there was a great power in the unseen. He said to me that our heritage often spoke of vampires and their immortality. He thought it would be very cool to live forever at any cost. Petrov dismissed his son's comments at the time, all the while knowing they could mean trouble. He warned Charles that about the blood oath and gave him the sacred instructions to carry out in privacy. I warned him not to change the ritual at all or, God forbid, do anything to disgrace or blaspheme it. I told him there is a great power in it for good and evil. When I said that, he smiled, so I assumed everything was fine. But when he heard about about the box of the earth, a key element of using the blood oath's power for evil gain, Petrov was shocked. He told her to get the box immediately and dispose of it. Petrov realized that Charles was using the secrets of the oath for his own gain and, coupled with his new friends, weird clothing, and Anna's concern over the blood on Charles's shirt, Petrov recognized all the telltale historical signs of attempts to use the blood oath to satisfy the lust for power and riches. He had had a long talk with Charles about the oath and was pleased by his son's earnest interest. Charles seemed genuinely excited about its history, the effects it had on the binding of the males of the family, and especially its mysterious powers. Petrov didn't think it was odd for Charles to ask so many questions, even considering that most of them centered on the oath's ability to grant power. He even dismissed Charles's most obvious excited question as boyhood exuberance for the fantastic when asked, "Papa, you mean I can become immortal?" But after Anna's alarming discoveries, Petrov feared the worst. He felt that the ancient curse was about to befall the Sigasaur family, a curse that he could not control without help from both this world and the supernatural. Now, the first celebrity interview I ever conducted was back in the 1970s with renowned Dracula hunter Dr. Raymond McNally, author of In Search of Dracula. It was fascinating to learn that the legends and myths of vampires, especially in Romania and the region of Transylvania, were largely based on fact. McNally was the first to make public the story of the Romanian ruler and conqueror Vlad Tepes, also known as Vlad the Impaler, as the archetype for the mythical vampire Dracula. At the same time, he didn't discount factual vampirism, or at the very least the belief and the psychological results of the belief in vampires. When the opportunity arose to take a pleasurable Dracula tour vacation to the heart of Transylvania to explore the history of the world's most famous monster, I jumped at the chance. My trip was booked well in advance, and I look forward to being able to relax and study the Dracula legend as a total indulgence without the pleasures or pressures of business. But my hopes were short-lived. A friend and colleague, Dr. Brad Schultz, a social service psychologist in New York City, called me one evening while I was sitting contentedly in front of my apartment fireplace and thumbing through the travel brochures. "Brad, good to hear from you. I was just looking at the materials on my trip to Transylvania. It's going to be great. I can't wait to go." But Brad said that it was a coincidence that I had mentioned the trip because I had just had an interesting visit from a local couple that had family in the region. I didn't think it was much of a coincidence until Brad began telling me of the Sigasaurus' visit with him and their dilemma. He said that they had no one to turn to about the problem with Charles, and because they had visited with him before about a minor problem with Charles's adjustment to high school, they were comfortable with Brad and felt he could be trusted. Even though their new problem was far from anything Brad had dealt with before, the couple was desperate for help of any kind. Brad went on for the better part of an hour, explaining the story of the Sigasaurus family's blood oath and their problem with Charles. I was fascinated, and as Brad spoke, I knew that my pleasure trip to Transylvania would soon be mixed with business of a most blood-chilling kind. I agreed to help the concerned couple and told Brad to have them see me prepared with everything germane to the curse. The Sigasaurus visited my office the very next day just around noon. Considering it was a cold November day, I was surprised to see they were dressed only in very light outerwear. We are used to the cold. In our country, it is usually dark and rainy and very cold, Anna said. I thought to myself that now my vacation wouldn't only be mixed with business, but that I'd freeze my butt off as well. But duty called, and I listened intently. Anna and Petrov explained that they believed Charles was using the rituals of the blood oath, particularly the mixing of the blood and the dead earth, or cemetery earth, together and then calling on the dark forces for power and revenge. They recounted Charles's transformation from a normal boy to one obsessed with dark role-playing and odd clothing. The blood-stained shirts were their real concern. The parents felt that Charles was delving into a dangerous world, and if he perverted the blood oath, the ancient curse would ruin his life and perhaps condemn his immortal soul. There was only one solution. Someone would have to visit the town of Sigasoria in Transylvania, meet with a relative of the family who had the gypsy site, and perform the necessary ritual to reverse Charles's actions. I asked why they couldn't have simply written a letter to, or at least telephoned the relative to have this ritual performed. Why was it necessary to ask a perfect stranger to travel halfway around the world? Because to reverse the ritual, Petrov said, Charles must be present himself in the homeland, and we cannot afford to send him there, and he would of course resist. The only alternative is to have him take the blood oath with someone here, and that person can then seek the gypsy in Romania. So you want me to be Charles's proxy for the ritual in Transylvania, I asked. Petrov nodded. He mentioned that it was a simple ritual and there was not very much bloodletting to bind with Charles. To me, any bloodletting was too much, but by that time I was hooked on X Investigations' first international case. As I boarded the plane bound for Bucharest, I recalled the ritual that had subsequently taken place in the Sigasaurus' apartment. We fabricated a story about how I was a long-lost relative who never participated in the blood oath, and Charles was the only person in the United States who was fresh enough to transfer the right to a new member. Charles accepted the ruse, thinking, I'm sure, that any knowledge of the rituals and the power would benefit him in the long run, so there was no resistance. In fact, the only glitch was for me, when it called for us to cut our left wrists with a ceremonial dagger and meld the dripping blood brother style into both of our arms. I was the one who was a bit squeamish, but the squeamishness wasn't the worst part. I also had an odd feeling of dread, especially when I raised my head and saw Charles staring intently into my eyes as the blood was exchanged. He stared at me with a disconcerting hunger in his eyes, almost pushing me to the point of telling the Sigasaurus that they should find themselves a new investigator. I knew at the moment that this was no ordinary psychodrama ceremony. It was the real deal. And then that's it. That's everything associated with part 1 of chapter 3, called The Transylvanian Curse, from the book Occult Investigator, Real Cases from the Files of X Investigations. So let's talk about that here as far as part 1. First off, lots of interesting things hitting all at once, right? Here you have a family, international foreigners at least, in the case coming from the Transylvania area and then living here in the United States. And then they have their young son, Charles, apparently becoming of age, in their minds at least, becoming 16 years old and performing something unique. I'm still kind of scratching my head on it, but it has to do with some kind of manhood ritual that I guess is symbolic, associated with their family and who knows how many other generations before that as well. It was almost like a blood oath, something else involving a transitioning period. And this was something that is almost like mixed in with religious stuff, almost mixing in with some kind of family code. Strange. I'm still, again, scratching my head about it, but this was at least what was explained within the chapter. But what was interesting, too, is that if this particular code was messed up in any way, maybe even accidentally or, of course, purposefully, then it would lead to horrible, horrible stuff. Like it would lead to the idea that somebody would essentially be cursed, not just living for the rest of their life, but even afterward as well. Obviously, it looks like in this case, that's what was happening with Charles. Once he heard about that blood oath, once he heard about whatever was happening with regards to the potential powers associated with that oath, about using it not for good intentions, but more from on the lines of bad ones, especially when it came to his fascination of gaining immortality, about living forever. That's when things took a whole different turn. And then, of course, the mother, Anna, finding that box containing that earth ground, or that ground from a cemetery, it seems like, not just that, but bone fragments, alerting her, and then also alerting the father, and him realizing that this was going to be a big issue, that their son was basically going into a dark path that they didn't want him to, but it's almost like the son had no control over it, like he was obsessed with power at that point. It again takes a whole different turn there. Interesting stuff. I can't wait to see at least what happens on the second part to find out. As far as all those things associated with doing incantations and the spells and so on, I'm always of the idea that don't do that stuff. That is not something that's good. You would have to be very, very, I don't know, an expert, right? You'd have to be, even then there would still be some risk associated with it. It's not for the novice. It's not for anyone that's trying to use it even for practical purposes, let's say even for beneficial ones, because that stuff can get out of control very fast. And as we're seeing here, it looks like that's what's happening with Charles. So some of you have suggested in the past about talking about certain things related to that, and I'm like, nope, not at all. I'm not doing anything as far as those kind of incantations and rituals and so on, just because of the idea that there's power behind them, and I don't want to mess with that kind of power. So something else that I don't advise for anyone here too. All right, everybody, I'll go ahead and I'll leave it here. I'd love to hear what your own comments are with regards to part 1 of chapter 3, and then I'll do the other part 2 sometime soon. All right, everyone, thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.